It starts like so many ordinary days do, quietly and without warning, the kind of day where nothing feels wrong until it's already too late. And that's what makes this story so deeply unsettling. Somewhere between routine phone calls, familiar faces, and everyday trust, a reality was unfolding that no one could have imagined. A reality that would later leave investigators stunned and audiences asking how something so horrifying could exist outside of fiction. When people first hear the name Andrea Cincotta, they don't expect a nightmare. They don't expect a story that rivals the darkest horror films ever made. Yet what happened is far more disturbing, precisely because it was real. There were no eerie soundtracks, no dramatic camera angles, no obvious villains lurking in the shadows, just a life that appeared normal on the surface, hiding decisions and actions that would eventually shock an entire community. At first, everything seemed explainable, even harmless. Small inconsistencies brushed aside, strange moments ignored. Because we're conditioned to believe that evil looks obvious, that danger announces itself loudly. But in this case, it didn't. It whispered. It blended in. And as days turned into weeks, those whispers grew into something impossible to ignore. What investigators would later uncover wasn't a single moment of madness, but a series of calculated choices, each one pushing the story further into darkness. This is the kind of case that forces you to sit back and remind yourself that you're not watching a movie, that no writer designed these twists for entertainment, and that real people paid the price for actions that still defy logic. As we step into the unbelievable story of Andrea Cincotta, you'll hear details that feel unreal, moments that make your stomach drop, questions that may never have satisfying answers. This isn't just a story about what happened, but about how easily trust can be manipulated, how danger can wear a familiar face, and how real life can create horrors far more disturbing than anything imagined on a screen. Once you hear how this story unfolds, you may never look at normal the same way again, because this case proves that sometimes the scariest stories don't come from nightmares. They come from reality itself. The story of Andrea Cincotta does not begin with violence, police sirens, or headlines. It begins in the quiet, ordinary spaces of everyday life, where nothing feels dangerous and everything appears familiar. Friends described Andrea as unremarkable in the way most people are. Someone who blended easily into the background, neither especially alarming nor especially memorable. That normalcy is exactly what allowed the events of this case to unfold unnoticed for as long as they did. There were routines, predictable patterns, conversations that sounded harmless, and a sense of trust that no one questioned because there seemed to be no reason to. This is how real-life horror often begins, not with chaos, but with comfort. And it is within that comfort that something deeply wrong was slowly taking shape. Those who knew Andrea Cincotta would later say there was nothing that immediately stood out as dangerous. There were no public outbursts, no obvious signs of instability that demanded attention. Instead, there were subtle behaviors that only made sense in hindsight, moments that felt slightly off, but were easy to explain away at the time. A strange comment here, a delayed response there, a habit of avoiding certain questions. None of it felt urgent enough to challenge. Like so many real cases that end in tragedy, the warning signs didn't scream, they whispered. And whispers are easy to ignore when life feels normal. As time went on, Andrea's relationships became more complicated. Trust played a central role in how events unfolded, because trust always does. The people closest to Andrea had no reason to believe they were being misled. They believed what they were told, accepted explanations without digging deeper, and assumed honesty because that is what functional relationships are built on. But beneath those relationships was a carefully constructed narrative, one that Andrea controlled with precision. Stories were shaped, details were omitted, and truths were bent just enough to maintain appearances. It was not chaos that defined Andrea's behavior, but control. Behind closed doors, however, the reality was far darker than anyone realized. The version of life presented to the outside world did not match what was happening privately. Investigators would later discover that key moments had been deliberately staged, conversations strategically manipulated, and timelines subtly altered. Andrea did not rely on sudden acts of violence or explosive confrontation. Instead, everything unfolded slowly, methodically, and deliberately. This was not an impulsive descent into wrongdoing. It was a calculated progression. What makes this case so unsettling is how long it took for anyone to realize something was truly wrong. Even when inconsistencies began to appear, they were often dismissed as misunderstandings or stress-related issues. People wanted to believe the best, because believing the worst would mean accepting that someone they trusted was capable of something unthinkable. And that kind of realization is deeply uncomfortable, so doubts were suppressed. Questions went unasked, and Andrea's narrative continued unchallenged. Eventually, the cracks grew wider, stories no longer aligned. Small lies collided with bigger ones. Timelines stopped making sense. Those closest to the situation began to feel a growing unease, a sense that they were missing something important but couldn't quite put their finger on it. This was the moment when suspicion started to replace trust. But by then, the damage was already done. Whatever Andrea had set in motion was far beyond anyone's ability to stop quietly. When authorities first became involved, they didn't immediately recognize the full scope of what they were dealing with. At first glance, it appeared to be a situation that could be resolved with routine questioning and basic fact-checking. There was no immediate sign of a larger crime, no dramatic evidence that pointed to something sinister. Andrea appeared cooperative, calm, and composed. Answers were given smoothly, without hesitation. But experienced investigators know that calm can sometimes be a mask, and composure can be rehearsed. As the investigation deepened, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Statements changed subtly over time. Certain details were remembered too clearly, while others were conveniently forgotten. Evidence that should have existed was missing, and explanations for its absence felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Slowly, piece by piece, investigators began to realize they were not dealing with an accident or a misunderstanding. They were dealing with intention. The moment the truth began to surface was not dramatic in the way movies portray it. There was no single revelation that suddenly explained everything. Instead, it was a gradual accumulation of facts, each one making the picture darker than the last. When investigators finally understood what Andrea Cincotta had done or allowed to happen, the weight of it was overwhelming. This was not just a crime. It was a betrayal layered upon deception, carried out over time, and hidden behind a carefully maintained image of normalcy. For those affected, the realization was devastating. People replayed past conversations in their minds, searching for the moment they should have noticed something was wrong. Every interaction was re-examined, every memory questioned. Guilt settled in not because they were responsible, but because they had trusted. And trust, in this case, had been weaponized. The Andrea Cincotta case forces an uncomfortable question on anyone who hears it. How well do we really know the people around us? It challenges the idea that danger always announces itself, that evil is always obvious. This story proves that sometimes the most frightening things are hidden behind smiles, routine, and familiarity. And as this case continued to unfold in the public eye, it became clear that the horror was not just in what happened, but in how easily it went unnoticed. By the time the full truth came to light, there was no undoing what had already occurred. The consequences were permanent. Lives were altered forever. And the name Andrea Cincotta became associated not with normalcy, but with one of those rare real-life stories that feels impossible to comprehend. A story that lingers long after it's told, because it reminds us that reality can be far more disturbing than fiction and far more unpredictable. As investigators pushed further into the timeline surrounding Andrea Cincotta, they began reconstructing events minute by minute, conversation by conversation, because the truth in this case was buried in details that at first seemed insignificant. Phone records were pulled, messages reviewed, and witness statements compared against one another. What initially appeared to be small discrepancies soon revealed a pattern, one that suggested Andrea had been shaping reality to suit a specific outcome. Times didn't align. Locations shifted depending on who was being spoken to. Certain actions were emphasized, while others were minimized or erased entirely. It became increasingly clear that this was not confusion or faulty memory. This was design. The deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the picture became. Andrea's version of events painted a story of coincidence and unfortunate circumstance, but the evidence told a very different story. Surveillance footage contradicted statements. Digital footprints exposed movements Andrea claimed never happened. Even emotional reactions seemed inconsistent, too controlled at times when distress would be expected, too dramatic when attention was needed. Detectives began to suspect that they were dealing with someone who understood how to perform innocence convincingly. Someone who knew which emotions to display and which facts to conceal. Friends and family were brought in for questioning, and many were shocked to find themselves sitting across from detectives at all. For them, Andrea had always been someone they thought they knew. Hearing investigators ask pointed questions about behavior, motives, and past interactions forced them to confront an uncomfortable possibility that the person they trusted had been hiding something profound. Some defended Andrea fiercely, unable to reconcile the accusations with the person they believed they knew. Others began to recall moments that suddenly felt wrong in retrospect, moments they had dismissed but now couldn't ignore. As statements were gathered, contradictions multiplied. Andrea had told different people different versions of the same event, tailoring each story to fit the audience. What was especially chilling was how natural it all seemed. There was no panic, no visible strain when confronted with conflicting evidence. Andrea adapted smoothly, adjusting explanations just enough to maintain plausibility. To investigators, this adaptability wasn't reassuring, it was alarming. It suggested experience, forethought, and a deep understanding of how to manipulate perception. The turning point came when forensic evidence entered the picture. Physical details don't bend easily to lies, and in this case, they spoke loudly. Objects were found where they shouldn't have been. Marks told a story that contradicted Andrea's account. The sequence of events Andrea described simply could not have happened the way it was claimed. When confronted with these findings, Andrea didn't break down the way many suspects do. Instead, there was hesitation, just enough to suggest calculation rather than shock. This moment marked the shift from suspicion to certainty. Investigators no longer questioned whether Andrea was involved. The question became how far the involvement went and whether anyone else had unknowingly played a role in enabling it. As the scope of the case expanded, it became clear that what had happened was not a single isolated act, but part of a broader pattern of deception that had been unfolding quietly over time. Andrea hadn't just reacted to circumstances. Circumstances had been engineered. The psychological profile that emerged was deeply unsettling. Experts later described behaviors consistent with someone who valued control above all else, someone who believed they could manage outcomes by managing people. Truth, in this mindset, was flexible. Morality was secondary to convenience. And empathy, if present at all, was selective. This didn't make Andrea a monster in appearance, but it did make the actions far more disturbing, because they were rooted in deliberate choice rather than uncontrollable impulse. As the case moved closer to public exposure, pressure intensified. Media interest began to grow, and with it came scrutiny Andrea had not fully prepared for. Unlike private conversations, public narratives are harder to control. Reporters asked questions that couldn't be easily redirected. New witnesses came forward with information that added further cracks to the story Andrea had constructed. Each new revelation made the truth harder to deny and the consequences more unavoidable. When the full scope of the case finally came into focus, the reaction was immediate and intense. People struggled to understand how such a complex web of lies could exist without detection for so long. Commentators compared the story to psychological thrillers and horror films, not because of graphic violence, but because of the sheer disbelief that real people could orchestrate something so calculated while appearing so ordinary. Andrea Cincotta was no longer just a name-it, became a symbol of how deception can hide in plain sight. For those closest to the case, the emotional toll was devastating. Trust was shattered. Relationships were permanently damaged. Some individuals questioned their own judgment, wondering how they had missed what now seemed obvious. Others were consumed by anger, not just at Andrea, but at themselves for believing the lies. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond the immediate facts, leaving lasting psychological scars that would never fully heal. As legal proceedings loomed, the narrative shifted again, from investigation to accountability. The evidence assembled against Andrea was substantial, built carefully over time to ensure that no detail could be dismissed. Prosecutors knew this was a case that would be scrutinized heavily, and they prepared accordingly. Every document, every timeline, Every inconsistency was laid out methodically. This wasn't about drama, it was about truth. Yet even as the walls closed in, Andrea maintained an outward composure that continued to unsettle those observing closely. There were no grand confessions, no emotional collapses that might offer some sense of closure. Instead, there was silence, restraint, and a refusal to fully acknowledge the damage caused. For many, this was the most haunting aspect of all: the absence of remorse, the lack of visible regret. By the time the case reached its later stages, one thing was undeniable. This was not a story that could be neatly wrapped up or icily forgotten. The Andrea Cincotta case lingered in the minds of those who followed it because it exposed something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. It showed how easily appearances can deceive, how trust can be exploited, and how real-life horror doesn't always involve blood or darkness. It can unfold quietly, patiently, and right in front of us.